So the Next.js version 13 has been released and there are a lot of new features with this version. So the Next.js is testing some of the features like the app directory, which is the brand new replacement for the earlier pages directory in the Next.js 12. So if you've watched my earlier tutorials on the Next.js like the file-based routing, and we have made this video around 6-7 months ago, and we also created full stack bookstore application with the Next.js as well. So we created that with the Next.js 12 and this is still valid inside the Next.js 13 because the Next.js 13 still supports all of those features of the Next.js 12 because this app directory and the turbo pack is currently in the alpha and the beta versions. So they are up for the testing and the feedbacks. So we'll discuss all of those features of the Next.js 13 inside this video, and in the end we'll be creating an application which will be a goals application in which a user can enter their goals and he or she can view their goals as well with the help of the routing. So what we will do is we will create the application with the app directory which is currently in the beta, and then we'll be using the turbo pack to compile everything. We'll be using the next image, we'll be using the fonts, we'll be using the next link, which is very simplified in the Next.js 13. So now let's move on into the Visual Studio Code to create the brand new Next.js application. So you need to create a brand new Next.js application. So for that you can move on into the docs. You can click on the getting started and here you can see we have the see the new beta docs. So we can click this and you can see now we are into the beta versions of the Next.js which is at 13, and there are some stable docs as well, but we need the demo of the app directory which is a brand new app directory, and this is in the beta version as of now, and the APIs are very likely to change in the future Next.js versions. So what we'll be doing is we'll be just creating a demo of the Next.js 13. So what we need to do, so we need to create this application. So we need to move on into the installation, and here you can see we have the automatic installation. So what you need to do, so you need to copy this command of the npx create next app @latest and make sure you add the experimental app flag inside this, because without this, if you won't add this, so the app directory feature will not be available with your application. So now let's copy this command and we can move on into our Visual Studio Code. So we can just paste this command over here. So we have this command here. So we need to create this command npx create next app @latest and this new experimental application flag. So we need to hit enter and then it will ask a couple of questions like what is the name of your application, which will be a my app, and then would you like to use TypeScript. So you can just click on the no if you don't want the TypeScript, and would you like to use the ESLint as well. So we can use the ESLint, and you can see now it is creating a brand new Next.js application. So we need to wait until it creates a new Next.js app inside this my app directory. So the application is created and now we can move on into the cd into the my app directory. So cd change directory into the my app, and then we can just start this application on the development mode with the npm run dev. So it will just open the port of the localhost 3000 inside this application, and this will be ready on the port of the 3000. So we can just control and click, and then you can see now we are into the localhost port of the 3000, and then you can see this is the brand new Next.js 13 hello world. So we can have the get started by editing the app.page.jsx. So here you can see this is the starting page of the Next.js application. So the first major change with the Next.js 13 is the brand new app directory. So now let's see the demo of this brand new app directory. So what you need to do, so here you can see inside this app directory, first we have the globals.css file, which is the CSS file, which is of no use as of now. And we have the head.jsx to add the head links inside our application like the title, the meta tags for the SEOs, and the link tag for any fav icon or anything. And we have the layout.jsx file, which is very important, which we'll discuss later on. And then we have the page.jsx file. So this is the replacement for the index.js, like inside the pages folder inside the Next.js 12, what we did. So if you want to create a route like the dashboard, so we created like this, and after that inside that we created a route like the index.js. So like this we created some pages inside the Next.js 12, but now this is not supported. So if you want to create a new page inside the Next.js 13, so what you need to do, so you can just click on this folder. So you need to create that folder of that page, like that should be equals to the dashboard. And after that you don't need to create the index.js, so you need to create a page.jsx. So you need to create the page.jsx with it, and then you can just create your function as well for this page, like function the page, and you need to export it as a default export. And after that you can just return something, like you can just return here the dashboard like this. So you can just return the div with the dashboard. So if you will save, if you will move on to this application, and then you can see if you will move on into the localhost port of the 3000 slash, that should be equals to the dashboard, and then you will see this dashboard here. So here you can see now we have this dashboard inside that. So that's the styles. So we can move on into the globals.css. So we can remove all of those styles as of now. So if you will save, if you'll move on to the application, then you can see now we have the dashboard. So this is how we create the pages inside the Next.js. So the routing is very similar, but there's a major update as well. Like inside the app directory, you cannot create a page like this. Like inside the app, you create the pages like the dashboard.js, or you create the pages like the about.js or the contact.js, like we did in the earlier versions of the Next.js, like the 12. Like I want to show you a demo. So if we create the pages, like that should be the about.jsx, and then we can create some code for it, and then you can see we'll move on into the localhost 3000 about, and then you can see now the about us page will work. So you can see now there's an interesting thing, like the app directory still works with the pages as well. So they will still work if there are no any conflicts between them. So they both are supported as of now, and the pages directory will be removed after some couple of versions in the future versions of the Next.js. So if you will just add the pages inside your pages as well, inside the app as well, so both will work. And then you can see what I wanted to show you is, so if you will just create a page with the pages and the about.jsx, and inside that you can also create a new page like the contact.jsx, and then you will see if you will just create a function here like the rfce. So we have this contact, and then you can see the contact will also work like this. You have a contact page, and then you can see now we have the contact. But if you will just create this page inside the brand new app directory, then it will not work, because now this works on the basis of the page. So every folder has a separate page.jsx file which creates a route. So that's how the app directory works. So here if you create about us.js, the contact.js, then it will not work. So here if you want to create a route, then you only need to create a folder of that like the dashboard, and inside that you need to create the page.jsx file. So that's how the app directory works. And the second new feature is the layout. So if we move on into the Next.js docs, so if we just check the routing inside that, and we have the routing, we have the fundamental routes, and then you can see we have the terminology of the routing. So these are the terms, like first we have the app, and then we need to create the dashboard. So if you create the dashboard, then that will be a route, and after that we can have the nested routings with that as well, like the analytics. So if we want to create the analytics, so we need to create the folder inside the dashboard, and then we need to create the page.jsx for every other file. So that's how the Next.js routing works. And now we will see about the layout. So the layout is just a wrapper for all of those pages. So if we create the dashboard, or if we see the main app layout.jsx, so here you can see now what we are doing. So here we have the export default function, which is the layout, but it has a children. So here you can see now with the layout, so the Next.js has a by default functionality to make this component as a wrapper. So your page.jsx files wraps inside this children inside the layout file. So that's how it works. So if you want to create the layout for the dashboard, so what we will do, so we will just create the layout.jsx, and that is a reserved name inside the Next.js 13. So you cannot use it for any other component or any other file. So here, if you want to just create the layout like this, like the layout, and inside that what you can do, so you will just receive some props, like you will receive the props of the children, and these are added by default by the Next.js 13. And after that you can just wrap something inside that. So what it will do, so once you will move on into the dashboard, so the layout file will be executed, and what it will do, so it will be rendered as the layout. So the layout will be rendered instead of the page, and the page will be added just as a children inside this layout. So if we will just move on into the application, into the localhost 3000 slash dashboard, and if you will move on into the application, then you can see now you will see the layout inside that, because now it is targeting the layout page. And there you have the children, and the children is the actual page component of this dashboard. So if you will just render here the children like this, like the children, then you can see now the dashboard will work. So the layout is just a wrapper for all of your elements. So if you want to create a separate structure for your children's or anything, like we have a div. So if we just remove here the div, we had here the dashboard page. And after that, if we create the another div, and here we render the children, and now you can see we can just render the children inside that. So if we save, So then you can see now the dashboard page will be then displayed because that's available inside the layout of this dashboard, and then the actual page content will be displayed which is currently inside the page.jsx. So that's how it works. And the next thing is, if you want to add the dynamic route, then how can you do it? Like inside the earlier versions of the Next.js, you used to create a new file, like inside that pages, you created a new file like this, like the id.js, like id or any identifier.js file. So now inside the Next.js 13, so you need to create the separate folder for the dynamic route as well. So what you need to do, like if you are in the dashboard, you need to create a separate folder that should be equals to the id or any identifier that you want, and inside that you again need to use the layout or the page that you want. Like if we just create the page.jsx, and then inside that if we want to just create a separate component like this, like the page, like the dynamic page, and after that if you will just move on into the application, if you will just add something like the dashboard and slash id after that dashboard, so dashboard slash then anything after that like the 123, if we move on into that, then you can see now the dynamic page is being rendered. So that's how it works inside the Next.js 13. So you need to create the id folder, and inside that you need to create the page.jsx inside that, and then you can see we have the layout as well, which is the layout for the container. So with the container we have added the dashboard page, so that's a layout of the dashboard. And then you can see now that's how the Next.js routing works inside the Next.js 13. So if we have any page after the dashboard, then this dynamic page would be then rendered. So that's how the Next.js 13 works. And we can have the separate layout for this ID as well. But I won't be using the separate layout because I already have the layout for the dashboard. So that's how the dynamic route works. But here, if you want to just get the ID, that which ID did you got inside the parameters, then what can you do? So inside the dynamic pages, so inside the dynamic routes of the Next.js 13, so there is predefined props available, which is the params. So you can just extract that props from the params, and these are automatically provided to you by the Next.js 13. So you can have the params, and after that you can just log the value as well for the params. Like here we have the console.log, we have the params, and here params is an object which contains all of your routes and their identifiers. So we have this ID page, like this ID unique identifier. So we can have the params.id with the log. So if we save, if we move on into the application, then you can see if we refresh the page a couple of times, then you can see we have the 123. So you will be seeing the 123 inside this terminal. So that's how the Next.js dynamic routes works. So we get the params as well with this ID. So that's pretty easy with the Next.js 13. And then you can see now these are the logs which are available here. So these logs will not be available inside the console window of the browser. So if you will just check the console window, if you will just refresh the page or do anything, so then you can see now these logs won't be available inside the browser console. And why? Because inside the Next.js 13, every page, so every file inside the Next.js 13 app directory, so inside the app directory, every component that we create, every page that we create, that's a React server component. So what is a server component? So as we saw inside the Next.js 12, like we had some functions like the get server side props, the get static props, get static paths, so many components are there. So they were the client components, but they were actually being rendered inside the server. So they were the functions which used to communicate with the backend, which used to communicate with the databases. So inside the Next.js 13, now we don't need to write any get static props, get server side props, or get anything with that. Now what we can do is we can use the React server components. So the server components are just components which are rendered on the server side and not on the client side. So inside the app directory, every component that we create, every app, every page that we create is just a React server component. So these pages, these files will not be running inside the browser. So they will be running internally inside the node environment. So that's how the Next.js 13 behaves. So if you will just check this file, like we have the dashboard, we have this ID. If you will just check this file inside the sources, then you will not find this file. If you will just find the layout.jsx, like with the layout, then you can see now you won't find this file until and unless you use the feature. Like if you want to create the client component with the Next.js 13, so you need to add string here on the top of your application, and that would be equals to the use client. And then you can see now we have the use client. So if you will just add the use client inside your application, so then only this component would be available inside the client side. If you will just refresh the page, so if you will just move on into the console, then you can see now you got the 123 inside your browser. So that's how the Next.js 13 works. So each and every file component which are available inside the app directory is a React server component. So that's not available onto the client side. So these are rendered onto the server and then it is shown to you. So that's how the Next.js 13 works. So these are the features of the app directory inside the Next.js 13. So we see that how to create the routes, how to create the nested routes, and how to create the dynamic routes, and about the layout file, and so many things with that. So that's how the app directory works. So now we'll be creating an application with the Next.js 13 in which we will see a couple of more options of the Next.js 13 as well. So what we will build? So we'll build a goals application with the Next.js 13. So now what you need to do, so you don't need the dashboard. So you can just delete this dashboard as of now. And then you can see now you will get an error like this page could not be found. So you can move on into the localhost port of the 3000. And then you can move on into this hello world page of the Next.js. So we won't be using the pages as well. So we'll be deleting the pages here. So now these pages are not deleted. So now we will be building the goals app from scratch. So what do we need to do? So first we need to create a folder directory. So for the folder directory, we are in the app directory, which is currently in the beta. So what do we need to do? So we need to create a brand new folder, which will be the goals. And there we will be rendering the goals page where we will render all of those goals. So first let's start with the goals. So here we need to create the folder that should be equals to the goals. And inside that, as we did earlier, so we need to create the page.jsx file. So that should be the page.jsx, and here we will render the page content. But we need the layout for this application as well, because what we will build, so I can show you in the paint. So what we'll be building inside this application, so suppose this is a screen, and inside the 30% of the first part, so for the first 30% part, what we will be doing is we will be showing all of the goals. So all those goals which currently we have will be showing inside this 30% of the content. So we'll be showing like this is a goal and this is a goal again. So we'll be showing all of those goals like this. And after that, once the user will click any of this goal, we will be showing the details of this goal inside this 70%. So that's the functionality that we want. So once the user clicks on any of the goal, so we'll be showing the functionality on the right side. And make sure we will be having the header as well on the top. So in the top, we'll be having some header. So that will be a part of this application. So here, so that will be this application as the goals app. So now let's start implementing this. So first, let's build the layout for all of those goals. So here we have the page. So here we'll be creating a layout.js. So that should be the layout.jsx file. And inside that, what do we need to do? Is first we need to just add here the refce, which is the React arrow function export, and here this gives you a boilerplate code for your component inside the React. So we can have a component name as the goals layout. So we have a goals layout, and after that inside this what we will do is first we will just fetch all of those goals. So we'll be fetching the goals, and after that what we'll be doing, so we'll be just returning some JSX code, and inside that, so suppose this div is a parent container. So inside this parent container, we will be applying some styles very quickly. So inside this aside component, so we have defined the aside because inside the left 30% of the screen, we'll be having the list of all of those goals. And once we will click any of the goal, we'll be showing the details of that goal onto the right side. So for the aside is just a tab for the aside. And inside this aside, what we will be doing, so we'll be rendering the goals list. So here we need to render the list of goals. And after that, inside the second 70%, we'll be rendering the details of that goal. Means we'll be rendering the children. So every goals layout, as we saw earlier, that it accepts a children. So here we'll be accepting the children inside that, like this children. And this children will be then rendered here. So we need the dynamic expressions. And inside that, we'll be rendering the children here. So that will be our main motto. And now we need to create the list of that goals as well. So what we'll be doing, so we'll be moving on to the folder directory. And now we need the component for rendering the list of that goals. So what can we do? So either we can define a new folder for that components, and there we can define all of those handy components, or we have an option inside the Next.13 that we can define the page specific component. Like here we need to render the list of that goals. So here we can render the page specific components inside the goal folder itself. And that won't be rendered as a page because that was a drawback inside the pages. Like if we create the component, then it would automatically be created as a route. But here inside the app directory, inside the beta version of the app, so we have an option that we can create the components here only. So we can create the components here only. So that won't be creating it as a route, but the actual page which will be rendered will be the page.jsx and the layout.jsx. So here we can create the component, like here we can have the goals list. data.jsx, and inside that we can render the list of all of those goals. So here we can have the React arrow function export, and here we can render all of the list of that goals. And inside the props we can accept the goals as well. So we can have here the goals, and we can render all of the styling of that goals here. So here we don't have the data for that goals. So where can we get the data? So either we can just move on into an API, into a free API, and then we can just render the list of that goals. But here, if we don't have any API, so we can also create the API here. But what we will do is, as we discussed earlier, that so we'll be just showing you an example that how to use the React server components, how to make this component as a server component. So we'll be using the JSON file, which should be declared inside the public folder, so that we can fetch that JSON file. So inside the public directory, we can create the data.json file, and inside that we can just declare the list of the goals. So here inside that we can have the array and the array of objects. So here we can have the list of the goals like this. So what do we need to do? So we can just copy paste it few more times. So we have the ID that should be equals to the 2, and then we can have the learn to drive car, and here we can have the by April, and after that we can have the required items that should be equals to the call. So here we have two objects inside the list. So now we need to fetch this list. So now we need to render this JSON list inside the goals list component. So what can we do? So either we can use the use effect here, or we can use any fetch method from the JavaScript to fetch the details. But here, as we discussed earlier, that we have a server components of the React as well inside the React 18 with the Next.js. So what we will be doing is we'll be moving on into the layout.jsx. So here we have the layout, and after that we can just create this layout as an async component like this. Like how can we create the functions as the async inside the JavaScript? So before the parenthesis we add the async. So that's how we can just create the async here. And by default inside the Next.js 13, all of the pages which are added, all of the files which are added inside the app directory are the pre-default server components. So this is also a server component, and it is rendered on the server side and not on the client side. So here what we'll be doing, so here we have the goals layout, and now this is an asynchronous function. And after that what we'll be doing, so before that we can also write here the async function as well like this. So we have the async function, and that should be equals to, we can have the fetch goals. So here we have the async function that should be equals to the fetch goals, and after that what we'll be doing, so we'll be returning the list of the goals from this function. So what can we do? So we can have the const, we can have the goals, and that should be equals to the fetch. So we'll be having the fetch function from the JavaScript. So we have the fetch, and after that we need to add the URL of the goals as well. Like here we have defined the JSON file inside the public directory, so we can move on into the localhost 3000 / that should be equals to the data.json. So if we add the data.json, so here you can see now this is from where we can access the data file from there, and it is there on the server. So we can just copy that URL from there, and then we can just paste that URL here, and after that the fetch returns a response. So what do we need to do? So here that should be equals to the response. So the fetch returns a response, and after that we need to wait for this task as well, because that's a database operation sometimes. So we can add the await, and after that we'll be getting the response from there, and after that we need to convert the response to the JSON as well. So what we'll be doing, so we can have the const, we can have the data, that should be equals to, we can have the response.json. So with converting the response to the JSON, we'll be having the actual data from that array. So we'll be having this whole array with the JSON, and after that this is also asynchronous task, so we need to await for this as well. And after that what can we do? So we can just return the exact data that we got. So we got the exact data from there, and after that what we'll be doing is, we have defined the component as the server component, so we'll be fetching the goals from here inside this. So how can we fetch that? So we can have the const, we can have here the goals, and that should be equals to, we can have the fetch goals. So we can have the fetch goals with that. So the fetch goals returns a promise, so we can use the await here as well. So that's how we can use the server components inside the Next.js. So we can have the const goals, that should be equals to the await, we need to fetch for the goals, and the return statement will only be rendered once it will get the data. So that's the power of the server components. And after that we can just pass the goals to this list of goals as well. So here instead of that we can render the goals list. So here we can have the goals list with that, and with the goals list we can have here the goals as well. So we can give the goals, that should be equals to the goals that we got from this request. So we got the goals, and now we can move on into the goals list, and then we can just define the list of the goals. First we can just log the data of the goals. So here So here we are logging the data of that goals. So if we save, if we move on into the application, if we move on into /goals, and then you can see now inside this, I think we got an error. So the error is because we haven't defined anything inside the goals page. So here we can use the REFCE, and here that should be equals to the goals page. So here we have the goals page, and inside that we can use here the something like select any goal. So if we save, if we move on into the application, then you can see, if we just move on into the goals once again, if we refresh, then you can see inside the terminal window, we got the data of all of those goals that we have defined. So now you can see, now we have the goals list, and here inside that we'll be rendering the list of that goals, and here we have the select any goal. So this is how we can just click on any goals list, and then we can show the data of that goal there. So here we can just render the list of that goals here. And now inside this goals list, now we can just define some basic stylings as well. So here I have defined some basic stylings inside the goals list component. So we have a div, we have a style equals to the display flex, we have the flex direction equals to the column. So we need the items on the bottom of each other, and then we have the height. And here after that we will be rendering all of those goals. So here inside the expressions, we'll be using the goals dot, we can have here the map. So we'll be mapping through all of the items of that goals, and from there we will get the actual goal from there. And for every iterator we'll be having the link to move on to the specific goal. So after that we'll be having the link component from the Next.js. So we'll be using the link from the Next.js, and to import that we can move on into the top, we can import the link from, that should be equals to the Next.js. So that should be equals to the from next/link. So from there we can just import the link component, and inside that we need to pass here the ref prop as well. Like we can pass here the ref, and inside that, that should be equals to the ID of that goal. So we'll be rendering the ID of that goal from there. So that should be equals to the /goals / that ID of that goal. So the ID would be equals to the actual goal dot ID. So that will be equals to the goal dot ID. And if we just move on into the application, and if we just save, and now after that we need to add the name of that goal as well. So here inside that, inside this link we'll be having another div, and inside that we'll be having some basic stylings again. So we'll be having this basic styling with this div. So we have the padding of the 10 pixels, we have the margin as well of the 10 pixels from all of these sides, and then we'll be having the border radius. And now inside this div we'll be rendering the actual goal. So that should be equals to the goal dot goal. So if we save, if we move on into the application, then you can see now we have the learn React, we have the learn to drive car, and this is how we can just use the server component from the React. And then you can see, if we just click any of the goal like the learn React, then you can see now we'll be moving on to the local host port of the 3000, the goals, and / the ID of that goal. And here you can see, if we just click on the second goal, then you can see now we'll be moving on to the second ID of that goal. And after that we can give the basic styling again for the link as well. So here we'll be having this basic styling for this link component as well. So we have the text decoration, none, we have the color, we have the margin, we have the background, we have the border radius. And after that we can just provide the background color of the black as well for this. So we can have the background color like that should be equal to the white. So if we just define here the white color, then you can see now we have the learn React, and then we have the learn to drive car. And we can just define here the padding as well for this. So that should be equal to the padding, that will be 5 pixels. So if we save, if we move on again, then you can say now we have the learn React, and then we have the learn to drive car. And for every goal, once we will just select any goal, so now we need the details of that goal into the right side. So inside the select any goal page. So now what we'll be doing is, now we'll be moving on to the folder directory once again. So here we have the layout, which is the parent layout. And after that we'll be using this layout component only for the dynamic ID page. Like we saw earlier that how can we use the dynamic pages inside the Next.js. So that's how we can just define the dynamic page. So here we can define that folder, that should be equal to the ID of that goal, and inside that again we can define the page.js. So that should be equal to the page.jsx, and inside that we'll be rendering the actual content of fetching the goals from that ID. So first we need to add here the React arrow function export. So that should be equals to the goal details page, and inside that what we'll be doing is, first we need to get the ID of that goal. So for getting the ID, as we did earlier, so we get the actual params object inside that. So we have the params, and then we'll be logging the details of that params. So we'll be logging the ID from that params. So we can have the params dot that ID of that params, because we have defined the ID as the dynamic ID. So the identifier is the dynamic ID. So if we save, if we move on into the application, if we just click any of the goal like this, and then you can see now we got the one inside the terminal window. And if we just move on into the learn to drive car, and then you can see now we are into the goals/to page, and here we have the goals details component, because the actual content which is being rendered is a children, and the children is being rendered inside the layout.jsx. And inside this goal details, now we need to fetch the details of that goals as well. So we can again move on into the goal details page. So we have this page, and here we can just first fetch the details of that goal. So for that as well, we can just make this component as an asynchronous component. So we can have the async, and after that, first we can just fetch the details of that goal. So again, we can have the async function that should be equals to the fetch goal from id. So that would be equals to the function, and here we'll be passing the id here. So we'll be passing the id here, and that should be the goal. And here we'll be fetching the details of that goal like this. Like we can again have the const response that will be equals to the fetch from the JavaScript once again. And again we need the URL. So that should be the URL from there, I think. So we can have the localhost 3000, and after that we can have here the data.json. So we have the data.json, and after that we will get the data. So that should be equals to the data. That should be equals to, we can have the await. That should be equals to the response.json. So we'll be getting the JSON from that response. And after that, what we'll be doing is now we'll be returning the actual data with that ID. So how can we do that? So we can have the data dot. So that's an optional parameter that sometimes it takes some time to get the data. So we have the data dot find, because that's an array, and then we'll be having the iterator like the actual goal. So we'll be just fetching the details from that goal, like that should be equals to the goal dot id should be equals to the id. So then it will just return the goal which will find it by this id, and that's a fetch. So we need to await for this as well, like this we use the await. So here we have the fetch goal from id. So that should be await here like this. So we have the await here. So if we just save, and now what do we need to do? So we need to move on into the goals page. So that's also an asynchronous component. So we need to wait for some task before we render the JSX. So again, we can have the const, we can have the goal that should be equals to, we can have the await that should be equals to the fetch goal from id. So we have the fetch goal from id, and here we need to pass the id as well that we got inside the params. So we can have the params dot id. So we have the params.id, and after that we can just have the params here. And I think we did the code inside the wrong component, so we need to fix this as well. So actually we wrote the code inside the actual goals page, so we need to render this inside the goals page like this inside the dynamic page. So what we'll be doing is now we'll be just refactoring the code. So we'll be moving on into the page.jsx. So we'll be cutting out this function from here, so that function will be added here, and inside this page.jsx as well. So that won't be the goal. So we need to add the goal here inside this goal details page, and then we'll be moving on into again the page.jsx. So here we won't be having any params. So we'll be removing the params from here. And now we can move on into the page.jsx. So we'll be making this component as an async. So here we have the async component, and then you can see now we have the details of that goals. So if we just click on the learn react, and then you can see once we got the data of that goal, then we can just log the data as well. So we have the log that should be equals to the actual goal that we rendered. So that will be the actual goal. So if we save, if we just click any goal like this, like the learn to drive car, and then you can see after that we got the actual object from the server. So we got the ID2, we have the goal, we have the target, we have the required items, and then we'll be showing the list of that goals here inside this div. So we'll be having the three divs inside the styling. So first div will have the style that should be equals to the color, padding, and the display, and we'll be defining the gap. And then we'll be having the h2 for the title of that goal, and then the second div will have the padding of the 20 pixels, and same for the third div. And now inside this first div, now we'll be having the title of that goal. So we'll be having the expressions that should be equals to the goal dot the actual goal. So if we save, and then you can see now we got the content, and now inside the second div as well, what we'll be doing, so we'll be having the to be completed, and then we'll be rendering the target of that goal that should be equals to the goal dot target. So we have the goal dot target like to be completed by the April, and after that inside the third div we'll be rendering the required items as well, like that should be equals to required. and here we'll be having the goal dot required. So we have the goal dot required items. So now we have the required items. So now you can see now we have the learn to drive car, and that should be to be completed by April. And then we have the required car, and then you can see once we will just click on this goal, then you can see now we have the learn React to be completed by March and the required computer. So now you can see now we have created this dynamic page with the Next.js 13. So once we will just click any of that goal, we'll be having the details of that goal as well. And then we can just expand the list as well, and then you will be seeing the multiple items here inside the aside component. So that's how we can just create the applications, and that's how we can use the server component. And we have seen so many things with that as well, like having the links as well inside the application, having the server components, and demonstrating the app directory which is currently in the beta. So there were so many things, and in the end we can have the header of this application as well. So what we'll be doing is we'll be moving on into the main component, which will be the main page, like the goals page. So here we have the goals page, and I think the header should be available throughout the application. So we can move on into the layout.jsx page inside the main layout of the app layout, and here we can just render the header after this head. So here we have this children. So now we can just remove this children as of now, and from this body we can just define the header of this application. So for the header, there will be some stylings as well. Like here we have the header component. So here we have the header, and here we have defined the style for the header as well. Like the width would be the 100%, the height would be the 50 pixels, the background color will be this specific color, and we have the display equals to the flex, and then we have the align items that should be equals to inside the center, and then we have the unordered list as well. And there inside this unordered list, now we'll be rendering the links as well. Like here we have the first link, and here we have the second link. And now for the first link, what we'll be doing is we'll be defining the ref for that. So the ref will be equals to, we can have the slash home, or slash we can have the nothing after that, and after that that should be equals to the home. So we have this home, and then we have some basic styling for the link as well, and same for the second link as well. We can define the ref, and the ref should be equals to, we can have the slash goals. So here we have the slash goals, and after that we'll be having the goals here. So that will be the header. And now after the header, now we can just render here the div to render the actual children content. So we have the children with that. So if we save, if we move on into the application, then you can see now first we have this header, we have the home, we have the goals, and now we can just change the color of the links as well. Like here we can have the color that should be equals to, we can have here the black for the text, and here as well we can just define the same color for that. So here we have the style, we can define the color equals to the black. So now we have the homes, we have the goals, and once we will just click on the home, so now you can see now we have the Next.js 13 template, and once we will just click on the goals, now we are into the goals, and once we will just select any goal like this, so now we have this goal, and we can select this, and then you can see now this goal will be rendered here. So that's how we can just create the applications with the Next.js inside the Next 13. And the final thing is, now you can see now we are getting some margin between the content. And I know that the styling of this application is not good, because we were focusing on the functionalities part, that how can we do some things. So that's how we can make the applications with the Next.js 13. So now the last thing that we will see is how to implement the loading and the error functionalities inside the Next.js 13. So here we have defined the ID page inside that. Like suppose if we don't find any goal with that ID, like if the ID is wrong, or we don't have anything inside the array which matches this ID, then what we'll be doing is we'll be rendering an error component. But inside the Next.js 13, so we have a by default support for the error component. So if we get any error inside any route, inside any page, so we can just define the error.js page, and inside that page, whatever we write, that will be shown here inside that page, instead of that page. So here we have the page.jsx, so we can just define the error.js page. So that should be the error.jsx, and that's a reserved name inside the Next.js 13. So the error will be a client component. So by default, all the components are server. So to use the client, we need to add the use client on the top of that page. And after that use client, then we can just render the function for the error. Like that should be equals to the error page. That would be equals to a function, and there will be returning the JSX code as well. Like, so we can return any div that should be equals to the error, and that should be equals to the export function. So we need to export this function as well as the default export. So we can have the export default with that. So now we have this function with that. So if we just move on into the application, like here we have this error inside the ID page, inside the dynamic ID page. So if we move on into this application, so here we have the fetch code from ID. If we just pass here any ID that is not available inside this list, like inside this data.json, so we only have ID till the 1 and 2. So if we just pass here the ID which is not there inside that, like the 3, so if we save, if we move on into the application, then you can see now the error page is being rendered here. So that's how we can use the error. So that's how the error works. So we can just define any error page with that. So we can have the error, we can just define any styling for the error as well, like that should be equal to the color, that should be equal to the red. So with that we can define the error like this. So that's how we can use the errors. And then we can have the loading pages as well, like here we can just define another page that should be equals to the loading.jsx. And here as well we'll be using the use client features, that should be equals to the use client. And inside that again we can use the export default function. So we have export default, that should be equals to, we can have the loading component. So we have the loading, that should be equals to a function. And inside that we can return a loader as well. We can return just a static paragraph tag as well, like we have the return, that should be equals to the loading. So until the page will be currently in the load, then the loading will be rendered. So now we can move on into the page. So here we can render the actual params object, like the params.id. So if we just save, if we just move on into the application, then you can see once we will move on into this, then you saw the loading there. If we just click on this, if we just move on to this, then you can see now the loading was there. So we can move on into the developer tools and we can move on into the performance insights. So here we have the option of the no throttling. So we can make the CPU as the 6 into slowdown to check the loading as well. So if we just save, if we again move on into the learn react, then you can see if we just move on into the learn to drive car, then you can see now the loading component was being rendered. And again, if we just move on into any of that component here, then you can see the loading was being rendered. So that's how the loading works inside that. So now we can just make it into the no throttling once again, so that your Chrome doesn't hang. So that's how we can use the Next.js 13 to create our apps. So now these features are currently in the beta, so you can get some errors while building that component. And then if you get an error, then you can just report that error as well to the Next.js to improve the Next.js, and that will be a huge support from you guys. So that's it for the Next.js 13. So now inside this lecture, what we have built, so we have just discussed all of those features of the Next.js, and then we created an application with the Next.js 13. So that's it for today's video.